This is Elected, a podcast for women and our active accomplices in and around politics. I'm your host, Sarah Elder Chaminara, and today my guest is Amanda Kingsley Malo. In the spirit of reconciliation, it's important to me to share my personal commitment to reconciliation, to learning the history of colonialism and the ongoing systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous peoples. The land where I live, work, and record from is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. Hi, Amanda.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
We've talked before once. You had me on your podcast back in, I think, 2020.
2020. It was my very first lockdown project that I had done to keep myself busy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll get into it, but you have so many projects and you do so many things.
It is a key feature of mine. Yes, for sure.
Yes. So, my very high level intro for you is that you are a teacher. You're the founder of the nonprofit PoliticsNOW, based in Northern Ontario. And you're also a mom, an advocate. You're all over social media. But our conversation today is really about PoliticsNOW and letting people know about the work that you do there, which is, I believe, so you amplify, engage, empower women in politics in Northern Ontario to encourage them, their participation in boards, campaigns, as campaign managers, volunteers, and candidates.
Yes. That is a really great high level overview of what it is that we do.
Great. So tell me more, or not tell me more, but tell me about what was your entrance into politics? And then if you can tell me about how did that lead to starting PoliticsNOW?
Sure. Before I get started, I wanted to also acknowledge the territory that I am on. Because we're not on the same one. And so I am on Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. It is land that is known traditionally as Nswakamok, now colonially known as Greater Sudbury. And it's the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabeg and the Wanapitei First Nation, as well as Métis people. So how did I get into politics? Oh my goodness. It seems like such a funny, loaded question to me because I don't remember worlds in which I wasn't into politics. But the easiest explanation is probably that my parents are also political. Not in the same way that I am. They're not community involved. They're not activists. They are just people that watch the news a lot and have opposing ideologies. And so I guess that my origin story would be that my dad is a pretty staunch conservative supporter. My mom is a pretty staunch liberal supporter. This is something that they've always been. This is something that they talked about very openly in front of me and my siblings. I'm the oldest of three. And so all of my kitchen table conversations every night when we had dinner were dominated by current events and policy discussions and politics, in which they often disagreed. And we discussed, the merits of this policy or that policy or this viewpoint or that viewpoint, while, also interrupting so that someone could pass the potatoes. So in my mind, just having grown up around that kind of discussion in politics, it's always come really easy to me. And it wasn't until I was a teenager when I started having these discussions with other people that I realized that's kind of an anomaly. Mostly because I ended up discovering that either people didn't want to talk about it with me, or I would probably most often hear, oh, well, we never discuss politics or religion. It's not polite conversation, which seemed odd to me because that's all we talked about at home. And so I guess that would mean that in my late teens, as I was discovering, who I was as a person, that kind of felt a little squashed, as we do too often with girls. And so it remained something that I was very interested in, but something that I didn't talk about openly until I was in my mid-20s. And I was scrolling through Facebook one day I had just gotten married. And I don't know if other people have planned big weddings, but if you have, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This would have been like back in 2014. It had become my like entire personality and hobby to plan this wedding. Every night was like on Pinterest, doing this, doing that, making whatever I needed for the wedding, like doing invitations. So like that was like a year and a half of my life. And once I got married, I was like, oh man, like that hobby that I had of planning that wedding is completely gone. And so I'm just mindlessly scrolling through Facebook as you did back in 2014. And I saw this ad from the Liberal Party that was looking for community organizers and doing a fellowship in community organizing. And I remember thinking, oh, well, I love school. Like you said at the beginning, I'm a teacher. I'm a lifelong learner is probably how I would most accurately describe it. And so I decided to take a look at it and was like, okay, well, I mean, I don't know that I want to be a political organizer, but this looks really cool. I do a lot of volunteer work. It looks like it would be a really great skill to have in home. So I applied. I was the only person north of Toronto who ended up getting into the program and got a whole lot of really great political training. So I did that with the Liberal Party, where I ended up getting on the ground. And there were no candidates in my region yet. So I ended up, being able to organize candidate search and that kind of thing, which was not what other people in my fellowship were doing. I would log on to that call every Wednesday and they would be like, hey, I got to knock on a door today. And I'd be like, I was in meetings looking for candidates and I was organizing, like debates and like just doing really big stuff because I was the only volunteer that the Liberal Party had in my region at that point. This would be like, pre-Justin Trudeau as they were third party status and just trying to like rebuild. And so finally, when we did get candidates, I was the first volunteer that they had. And so as I brought on more, I became a more senior volunteer with more responsibilities and just ended up getting a lot of really great training. Those candidates went on to Ottawa after the election, after they, won when they were swept up in that red wave in 2015. And I stayed home because I love my job. I love teaching. I didn't want to leave it. And I discovered that the thing that I love most about all of this was the campaigning part. And so I was like, okay, well, how can I do that all the time? Like, what is it that I need to do to take these skills and just utilize it constantly without leaving my really great teaching job that I don't want to leave? And after Donald Trump won his election, it occurred to me that that's exactly what it was. If I wanted to see more women in politics, I needed to help train more women in politics. And it couldn't be at a provincial or federal level because those things are covered. Like there's, parties are constantly giving money and resources to their own candidates, and that's great. But there's a lot of really great ground policy work that is done at a municipal level that constantly gets ignored. And those people don't know how to run elections because many of them have never been taught how. And so I thought to myself, if I can take all of those tools that I have been using training volunteers federally, provincially, I can give those tools away for free to any woman who wants them. And that's basically like the how we started PoliticsNOW.
So Sudbury, and I mean, I'm coming to you from Alberta, Calgary. And so, it's always when you talk with people who live in the north, or I don't know where the invisible line is when you cross, north into south.
If you've ever heard of Muskoka, that's the invisible line.
Okay. In Ontario?
Yes.
That's the transition point?
That is what we would, for the most part, consider the transition point.
Okay.
Anything north of that. So like there's like a line between like Muskoka, North Bay. You would go north of that, becomes Northern Ontario. Yeah.
So because PoliticsNOW you've focused on, so in Northern Ontario, but is there a difference in your mind about running in the north, the Canadian North versus the Canadian South? Like, are those tools and skills different, or is there a crossover?
In some way, there is a difference, and I wouldn't necessarily say the North versus the South, although there could be some vast difference, just in as much as how much ability you have to ground game in the winter. I mean, I've seen parties hold days of action in the middle of February where they expect everyone to go and knock on doors. And I'm like, I can't recruit people in minus 35-degree weather to go knock on doors. Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So there's some difference there. But I wouldn't say that that's, like North specific. I would actually
Mhm.
say the biggest difference that I see in campaigning and what I try to design my campaign material for is the difference between big metropolitan cities and smaller cities and rural campaigning. And I think that that's something that gets lost in the mix a lot. And that's something that I've kind of honed through when I was working federally. I remember party organizers coming and training us and saying, okay, Amanda, you should be able to train your team when you are canvassing out, doing a door canvass, that they should be able to knock on 200 doors in an evening. And it was like, okay, cool. How many volunteers do I have? And they'd be like, oh, you probably have 14. I don't have 14 volunteers out here. That's not a thing, first of all. Second of all, where do you think that I'm canvassing that I can knock on that many doors? And
Well,
they'd
it's
be
not
like, well,
downtown Toronto.
that's it. And they'd be like, well, if you knock on, if you go to an apartment building, and I was like, okay, well, that's thing number two. Like, that's not a thing out here. There is, of course, there's apartment buildings, but there's not 200 units in an apartment building where I live. And even if like I lived in a more, urban riding in parts of Sudbury are, they absolutely are. Just like parts of Timmins and Sault Ste. Marie and anything that is up north. And I know that that's true in Alberta as well. But there are also parts of these ridings and areas where there's 3 or 4 kilometers between neighbors. And those people never get canvassed because there's never part of a canvass plan. It's just about like, how do I reach the most amount of people in the littlest amount of time? And that's great. I get the strategy. But we also have to form relationships with these other people that don't live in big urban areas. And we also have to make sure that we're being mindful of the fact that there are some people that are campaigning that never have any urban area to cover. And what about resources for them? And so that's kind of what I've tried to keep in mind when I'm creating training and when I'm writing my workbooks, or when I'm doing, whatever it is that I'm doing for PoliticsNOW, that it has to be adaptable for those people. And I think that that's really like where we've kind of built our organization. And just, I hate saying niche is such a weird word, but there are a lot of organizations that just give really great general campaign advice, and I appreciate that. But we're trying to make sure that that advice is adaptable for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is an important thing to consider and to remember, because yeah, you're right. On days of action, or whatever any other party calls it, when it's 10 degrees and maybe drizzly in Vancouver in March, it could be, minus 20 here, or minus 30 where you are. So yeah, getting people to go out, and is it actually safe to be outside for a long period of time, is like a very relevant question to ask.
Or even just like, how are you even going to recruit volunteers for that? Because I'm not going outside in that weather. I'm very much an indoor cat.
Yeah, no, that's very real. That's very real. And also, I mean, it is interesting to think about, especially, I mean, here in Alberta is very rural as well. And not just like rural, like, I mean, up north, it's a different kind of rural, but, around Alberta, we're surrounded by like farms and large properties. And you're right, they never get maybe door knockers, because you would maybe hit, a dozen houses in 2 hours, assuming you can even drive down their driveway, because a lot of them are gated, or, just have don't trespass signs, and, aren't, maybe they don't even want you to visit. But that's something really real to consider, and, how you target them, and who they connect with. And, maybe they only make contact with one political party and they never hear from any others because they just
Absolutely.
don't try. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that there's also a lot of like unfortunate and wild assumptions that are made about those areas of the country that maybe targeting them isn't worth it, and like worth the time or worth the effort. And I would counter that that is an unfortunate assumption, because when I was going out and I was going to more rural towns, or, more rural areas just of my riding, and when I was doing it federally, of course, I would sometimes be the first person that had ever knocked on their door, or the first person who had ever called them canvassing in a phone bank canvas. And that wins votes. We really underestimate the power of personal connection in that ground game when we just assume that we don't need to be calling those people or showing up to those doors. And I would often get people be like, you're the first person that's ever knocked on my door. You're the first person that's ever called me. And you're the first person that's ever listened. Most importantly, people just want to be listened. And for that reason, like, mark me down as a yes. Like, let's start building that connection, which is a really wonderful thing. And I remembered those lessons when I was doing the training in PoliticsNOW, which is why it's so important to me that we kind of have those resources available. And since then, some of those women, I trained over 200 people. So we founded in 2017. I trained over 200 people for that first municipal election, which would have been in 2018, October. I helped, assisted, consulted on 26 campaigns once the writ finally dropped by September. And 11 of those women won their elections, which was amazing. Many of them, I would actually probably say most of them, 3/4 of them, first time candidates that won their elections. And they won it based on ground game alone, many of them. Some of those women were coming back to me with stories about how, they had beaten incumbent who had been on council for 20 years, and they had beat them because they were going and knocking on doors. And it was the first time that anybody had ever cared to knock on their door, had ever cared about making a connection. And those were people that went out and voted. That makes a massive difference. And so I think that in municipal politics, it can often feel like the Wild West, because particularly where I live, I know that that's not true of every city or place in the country, but there's no slates out here. People are just kind of running. I think it's really funny how in municipal politics, you can say, I really care about the environment and I really want to do more to, combat global warming. And then on the other side, almost like, in the exact same sentence, say, I don't think we have enough garbage pickup. I want to increase it to twice a week. I just think that's wild. And you watch people do it all the time because they don't have parties backing them. They don't have slates of candidates. They're just out there doing this on their own. And I think particularly in places like where we live that are, it's not full-time jobs, it's all part-time jobs where we are. Municipal council can often get overlooked. It becomes a job that is given for people that are retired or, people that have their own businesses and therefore have a little bit more flexibility. And that really makes a difference in the kind of candidate that is running. But particularly with women, I don't know about you, but I do know that if I don't feel like I am the most prepared for something, I don't want to do it. And so I thought, like, by giving people those tools, by giving them tools that nobody else is using, if nobody else is campaigning and you're the only person knocking on doors, you're going to win. Like, that's not even a question. You're going to win. And if you don't, you'll have done everything in your power to win and you'll get it next time. Like, you're building that name recognition. So it's really wonderful work to watch.
So you talked a lot about resources. So can you talk about the ones that already exist? And then I know that you also have a new resource coming. So what are the resources that you've created and how do they help people?
So I'm a teacher. I mean, I know that you preface that. So creating resources, I feel like, is my love language. It is like what I do. And so the first go at it in 2018, I did a lot of training camps, exactly like you would see federally and provincially. I just invited anybody who wanted to, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of whether or not they had any experience, to do actual training. And COVID really meant that I had to reevaluate what that looked like. And so I still do that training online, but I've also created resources that are more available widely, not just for women in Northern Ontario, but just for people who want to run generally. And so I've got stuff like a list of 22 things that you can do if you're getting ready for an election, but it's not the next election. So, just some ideas like go join a board or a committee, or start, making connections with some local politicians, some local groups. Things like how to explore what your core values are for politicians, how to build a team of supporters, how to go out and get donations, how to go out and get volunteers, things like that are accessible. You also mentioned that I'm a mom. I consume I consume everything differently since I've become a mother. I don't have time in the regular pockets of the day that I did in 2018, especially not that there's two of them now. And so it just meant that I had to reevaluate the way that I approach campaigning as a whole, which means that I was like, okay, well, if I have to reevaluate how I'm providing resources, that means that there are women out there who need these resources done differently. And so stuff like how to plan your social media content. I'm just going to give you a social media calendar that you can just plug in and just do that way. I wrote 2 workbooks. So one of them is already out, and it's about exploring your run. And so it's over 35 pages of an exploration of what it means to want to run for office, the things that you should think about before you run for office, and then starting to get you organized before you actually put your nomination papers through. So just the A to say Z of exploring a run. And I am currently in the finishing stations of finishing a workbook that is about canvassing and all types of canvassing in general, specifically for municipal politics. And so that should be out very soon.
That's a lot of resources.
I told you it is my love language.
Creating. Oh, I wish that was my love language. I mean, I guess in some way, in small ways, maybe, but like a 30+ page document is really substantial, Amanda.
It is. I think that when we think about changing the world and how we want to change the world, we take the things that we're best at and we go out and we give them.
Yeah.
And you're doing that. Like, you've got this podcast, you're creating, your shirts and your merch and a whole bunch of really wonderful things that allows people to wear their politics on their person and to declare who they are as people out in the world. Like, that's really impactful. And that is the thing that I could not design a t-shirt. I've tried, I'm very bad at it, but I can make a really great workbook because I've got 12 years of pedagogical experience. And if I can get a 13-year-old to do, the kind of resources, although it's not resources like this, but it's the same pedagogical stance that I take when I'm creating them. And if I can engage a 13-year-old in those resources, like a 40-year-old woman is nothing.
Yeah. You're right. Well, and sometimes I don't want to sometimes made comment here at Madam Premier in the store is like, oh, like there are so many things for kind of like women in politics, but they're so American. And yes, you're right. First of all, they need them in different ways and have a different political system and have different political issues and different kinds of conversations going on, which thankfully up until very recently, I think we've been kind of out of the fray from. But I can see in the Canadian women in politics kind of content sphere that there are more things coming out right now, like I've in terms of like books being published, and there's kind of there's a moment right now in terms of women in politics in Canada, and I feel like it's really just kind of, we're still in the baby steps, but it's like it's becoming larger, and resources like the ones that you're creating absolutely contribute to that, and to like abolishing the status quo by acknowledging that there are systemic barriers that women face in politics, and this is how we're going to get around them.
Well, and I mean, like anything, like if people are telling you that, and I don't doubt it, because people talk to me about that kind of thing, just about resources all the time. Groups like mine exist all over the United States. Yeah. Groups like mine exist all over Canada, but I'm not sure that people know that. And we import a lot of our ideas and a lot of our trends, both to our detriment and, to the benefit of the cause that it is that we're trying to champion. And I think that when we think about women in politics, you're right. It's in the middle of a moment. I'm happy that there are organizations like mine that are ready for those women. I'm excited that there are businesses like yours that are ready to meet that moment as well. But I also think that it's important that we're here and that we're giving Canadian context for all of those things. I think about even just the conversation around abortion rights that's currently happening in the United States, and how absolutely, absolutely, let's talk about that. And let's talk about what that means for those women, because it is awful and it is detrimental and it is harmful. We also here in Canada need to talk about the Canadianisms that impact our policies and what that looks like, and putting that context in. And I think that for too long, people were just happy to ignore those parts of Canada. I think that the moment that you're talking about, not just in women in politics, is just we're having a moment where we're able to see each other differently, and we're able to see this country differently in a way that we've ever been able to before. And it can be hard to look in the mirror and not always like what you see. But I think that that also means that we have a really wonderful opportunity to grow in a lot of ways. And this is one of them.
Yeah, there's I see us as kind of standing on a cliff right now, with a couple of different options. One to me is definitely more concerning, in terms of like nationalism and populist conversations that are really dominating the conversations in the media and just overall. And there's actually, in my opinion, right now, a void on the other side, in terms of political parties on the opposite side of the spectrum. They aren't contributing, their voices are missing in terms of countering that narrative. And I fear that there's no going back, because we've already started down a trail that we won't be able to return from. But the Canadian content aspect of this, and I have so many conversations with so many different people, overwhelmingly women, but people, all kinds of people. And it's been the last, I'd say, month has been kind of, I'd say, a moment of realization that we're not immune to kinds of the things that are happening in the States, and that they're being touched by ideas and conversations and policies. And they're realizing that our own, everything that we take for granted is also vulnerable.
Well, and I think that that really lends perfectly into the fact that I think that media consumption, because in the States, it's just the dominating narrative, like being our neighbors, right? And I'm not judging, because at the beginning of this, I talked about how it was when Hillary Clinton lost her election that spurred me into action. And like, to say that I was like a massive Hillary Clinton fan, like I wouldn't even be able to say that. I followed the election closely in the way that, like, we kind of, those of us who are, considered politicos, I suppose, followed any kind of news cycle that way. But I remember sitting on the couch with my mom that night and watching a video that her team had released that talked about, the glass ceilings that were being shattered, and talked about her mother and her relationship with her mother and her relationship with her daughter, Chelsea, and what this would mean for women and girls all over the world. And my mom and I sat on that couch crying, and like, polls hadn't even come back yet, but we were like, oh my God, this is going to happen. Like, we get to sit here together and we get to watch the very first woman get elected to the office of president of the United States. Like, well, how wild. And the next morning when I woke up and that wasn't the case, I remember just being like flabbergasted, like, how did that happen? And the more that I think the more that I started thinking about it, the more that I was like, okay, like, why does this mean so much to you? Like, this isn't even your country. Why does this mean so much to you? Have a little bit of introspective and start thinking. And when I was thinking, it was like, okay, well, it's because I've never seen a woman run to be prime minister of my country, not as long as I can remember. I was, oh my goodness, I was born in 1987. And so I was like, what, 4 or 5 years old when Kim Campbell was prime minister. I don't remember that. But But I can tell you that I do remember, and this is something that came to me in my introspection, is that when I was in grade 7, maybe 8, and sitting in my classroom learning about history and civics, my teacher had this long wall of prime ministers. And I remember looking at the wall all the time. And like I said, like I am someone who's always been interested in politics. And my original Bachelor of Arts is in history. So you can imagine like my hand going up all the time. It's all I want to talk about. This is like the thing that sparks passion in me, is wanting to talk about these things. But I remember looking at the wall and just seeing men and men and men and men. Kim Campbell and more men. And at one point I had counted the names on the wall and I was like, there are more men on this wall named John than there are women. What, 95% of those men have multiple dates under their name, and she's only got one year, one measly little year. And when I asked my teacher about it, she was like, and I was like, well, we've had one prime minister. And my teacher was like, she wasn't even elected. And it just struck me that my entire life, people have been telling me, Amanda, you can be anything that you want to be. Can I? Because I was a 13-year-old girl in that civics class who was pretty much begging to be a politician or working in politics or doing some sort of civic work. And not only did my teacher kind of accidentally discourage that just by, well, she didn't even get elected, but that story from the wall told me otherwise. It told me that every boy in my class could be prime minister, but what are the odds that I could be? And we're telling that to girls all the time, because although I don't have that wall anymore, I now teach, and I teach about prime ministers, and we have not been able to add a woman to that wall. 35. That's insane. And so we need to start thinking about what that means and what those messages are for girls, and counter those narratives, exactly like you're saying.
Yeah. I actually have a new design that I made that says Madam Prime Minister.
Love it.
To hopefully, spark those conversations, talk more about, the history of Kim Campbell, how she was, how she became prime minister, what happened to her, the glass cliff that she was, dealt.
Mm-hmm.
And
us having to have those conversations about how this has happened multiple times since her, not at the highest office, but because we don't pay enough attention to what's going on in the provinces and territories next to us, that we now know that no woman has been, reelected. Like that's Kate Graham's whole podcast, like no second chances.
Yeah.
So I think that these conversations that we have about the United States are a really great way to gateway people into caring about our own issues and fixing those.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because it's definitely, I want to use these moments as a way to spark more conversations about things that, about Canadian history and about Canadian moments, but also saying, hey, it's time to elect another female prime minister. Because there's we've never grown up with one. And that means that I'm 39. So anyone who is younger than me hasn't as well. And it's time. Like it's more than time, actually.
Question for you. Are you worried about that? Like, so of course I want another woman prime minister, but you and I you were just mentioning that, you feel like the world is, or our country is at this moment.
Yeah.
Do you worry that, like, I worry because, I mean, for those who don't know, I should probably be more like transparent in what I'm trying to say. But there is a political theory that, particularly in Canada, that we see that when things are hard, we turn to women to lead us through it.
Yeah.
And
the glass cliff.
Exactly, the glass cliff. And that is often the only time that women get the opportunity to lead in our provinces and in our country. That's quite literally like what has happened to too many of the women in this country that have gone for leadership. And I worry that in this moment that we would be setting up a woman to fail.
You mean, let's say, so in the context of Pierre Poilievre winning the conservative leadership race and a woman coming in, say Justin Trudeau steps down, that she would be put
And
on the glass cliff?
yes, that is exactly what I'm worried about.
Yeah, I've definitely thought about that as well. I think I mean, there's a very real possibility of that, but to me, I see the women who could potentially step into that role on the Liberal side as being such strong contenders.
Oh my goodness.
Not to say that Kim Campbell wasn't, but I mean, Hillary, you know, it is a possibility. I think it depends on when Trudeau would step back and how that happens, and how much time, how much runway that person would have in the lead up to a federal election. Kim Campbell really didn't have a lot of time.
No, she didn't.
And so, you know, in my mind, I think the more time for that woman to come in and establish, you know, her own team, her own voice, her own campaign, and run things the way that she would want to, would set her up for success more than if it was done at the last minute. I think that would be incredibly harmful.
I hope that they take your advice. I feel like we should, like, I don't know, FedEx this over to people.
Well, you know,
because ultimately you're right. That is what I would love to see. I worry that this drags for too long.
Yeah.
And that because you're right, there are so many women that are in, like, both the NDP and in the Liberal Party that are, you know, MPs federally, that are amazing, just doing amazing work, that I would love to see Prime Minister. Like, sometimes, like, I just scan their Facebook pages and I'm just like, oh my God, like, I can't wait to vote for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's the thing. I can't wait to vote. I can't wait to vote for, well, I mean, you're not voting. Someone's going to be like, you don't vote directly.
No,
yes.
but I actually, like, you know, like, to be able to vote for that person, like, for the party, right?
For the party. Yeah.
Like, to be a party leader. Like, I can't wait for that. Like, there are so many really wonderful choices to actually choose from. That is how I felt about the Ontario Liberal Party. There is a lot of really wonderful women leaders to choose from. That ultimately, unfortunately, were not the people that they went with.
Well, but I mean, in Ontario provincially, you have, on the Liberal side, you have the opportunity now to find a new leader.
To try this again. Yeah.
Here,
same thing with the NDP.
Yeah. So yeah, as well with Andrew Horwath stepping down. And here in Alberta, we're going into we have a leadership race going on provincially for the UCP. So that person will become premier. There are 50% of the candidates running are women. You know, are they being put on a glass cliff? You know, they also have, it's a really interesting thing to see and watch. And then going into a general election next year where Rachel Notley will get her second chance to potentially become premier again after 4 years of the UCP. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see who's on that stage and who wins that race.
I'm fascinated by this because I think ultimately you're right. I think that we're, like, on a precipice of something, and we can either keep going in the direction that we're going in, or we can kind of hard stop and be more introspective and think about who we truly are as a country and how we want that country to move forward.
Well, I'm going to say something that I told this once to someone who was the member of the governing Liberal Party, who is no longer in government, but at the time, I said, you know, actually, so it was in 2020. And I had said, I'm thinking about doing a design that says Madam Prime Minister. And the feedback I got was, no, you shouldn't do that. We have a prime minister and he is a feminist.
Oh yeah, that's the same.
And there are people who say, you know, Trudeau is a feminist. So I'm sorry. Yes, it's great that he is a feminist. But I am ready to have Canada's second female prime minister.
I am.
Who can also be a feminist.
Absolutely. Well, so I was going to say, like, I'm very specific about that when I have these conversations, because even in the work that I do, it's not enough to me to just have a woman prime minister.
Right.
I want that person to be unapologetically feminist, anti-racist. I want her, tearing down systems of oppression in this country. I want this country to genuinely be better for everyone. And so when people ask me like, okay, well then why do you only provide your resources to women? And ultimately it's because we don't elect enough women. We don't have enough women that are running. When women do decide to run, they end up winning at almost the exact same rate that men do. So it's not a problem of actually electing them. It's a problem of convincing them to run. And so we need to systematically get rid of the barriers. We need to eliminate the barriers that exist in getting women to run, because that to me is the only way that we can get great women running. And I think that like, how can we be real about the fact that like we've got the best people for the job if 50% of the population isn't running? So it's not enough to just have women. I also want more people of color. I want more Indigenous people. I want more members of the LGBTQ2S community in politics. I want representation everywhere. This is just the way that I can contribute to that, to getting that 50% of the population out. This is the way that you're contributing to getting that 50% of the population out. But the work doesn't end at parity.
No, it's not like you hit a milestone and you're like, oh, I'm retiring from this.
Yeah.
Because there will always be forces that will always be determined. As we can see, let's use Roe versus Wade as an example. What was considered to be, the law, a precedent in the United States that an overwhelming majority of Americans support, and it's gone. And we don't know how long it will be gone for. It could be gone for generations.
Well, and one of those votes was from a woman.
Well,
which is why we know that it's not just enough to elect women. We need to elect progressive people.
Yeah. Which is, going back to kind of where we started the conversation was about ground game and door knocking and, identifying the vote. If you're the person answering the door, ask the candidates, you can ask direct and, tough questions of the person knocking. For example, are you pro-choice? Tell me, do you believe in, protecting rights for all? Tell me how you are anti-racist. Tell me, whatever it is you want, not just,
and those are great questions. Those are great questions. And I think that too often we ignore those municipally because we tell ourselves that that doesn't really matter because those aren't policies that we're working at a municipal level. But we've got tons of municipal elections that are coming up across the country within the next year or two. And those are great questions to ask those candidates because those viewpoints are going to inform how those people make decisions when they're voting for you on everything. And I know it seems silly to try and make, a tie between being anti-racist and the amount of garbage pickup that happens, but it exists. I think about, public transit, which is a municipal issue, and being anti-racist or anti-capitalist would absolutely inform the way that you vote on public transit. It's being intersectional in your way of thinking. And I think that ultimately that's what we need to ask our politicians to be, is to be intersectional in their thinking and think of the way that the policies that exist in our communities on a micro level affect all of the people in our communities, not just the people at the decision-making table.
Well, I mean, even that's a very valid question that you can ask of anyone, no matter what level, municipal, provincial, federal, is tell me what your intersectional approach to politics is. And if they're like, I don't know what that is, or they just, that can, maybe that decides how you vote.
Yeah. Can definitely be a red flag. And but I think what would be really interesting there is, because I'm definitely obviously a person who believes in second chances. And so if someone was like, well, I don't know what that is, I wouldn't fault them because we're all at different parts in our education, and self-enlightenment in this. But if that person demonstrated curiosity of learning and was like, I'm going to look into this and I'm going to do more to learn about what this is and what this issue is. And, like, let's have a conversation or touch base about this later. Or do you have any resources that I can look into? That would be a like, check mark in my column, because I'd be like, okay, so this person isn't where I'm at in my learning, but that's okay because they're willing to get, somewhere. They're willing to start, I guess, get on the bus, if we're going to use that metaphor. Whereas if someone just shut down that conversation, I would be very weary. I get that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so much of it depends on how someone responds on the door, even if they're talking about a fiscal issue and you're like, how much, would you put more money in childcare or, education or whatever social services. And they're like, no, or they try to change the topic and talk about something else. Like, you get to decide how you ask the questions, what follow-ups, and, you don't need to let them guide the conversation.
Talk to me about what you'd like to see in the police budget.
Exactly.
Because that's a municipal issue,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. So
really big decisions are made on the municipal table that I don't think people think about.
Yeah, totally. This is making me think about creating my own list of resources of questions you can ask politicians at the door. So
I love that. You should do it.
You're creating resources for the other side of the door conversation, and I can work on the individual ones.
Yes, I would love that. And I think that, like, ultimately that's what we need to do more of. And on a personal level, that's something that I'm kind of like trying to explore on my own. And so, like, I started this like funny, like, I'm on parental leave. I started like this funny project for myself, where I started teaching civics in 1-minute chunks. To try and help people engage in political conversations differently. And it's been really interesting to see the reaction to that and how people are learning about these things on a different way. I think that ultimately we need to do more to educate ourselves on just Canadian civic issues.
Oh, 100%.
And that, I think, is going to also go a really long way towards taking away the flammable parts of politics, the parts where people were like, oh no, we don't talk about politics because it's not polite conversation that we've all grown up around. Well, it's not polite because none of us know how to talk about it, which means that when we're in these conversations, we end up getting, like, anxious and things don't come out properly, or we don't know how to have a conversation or a debate about policy. When all of these things can feel very, very personal, and they should, because policy is personal. But if you don't know how to engage in conversation about it, we're just going to keep going on parallel roads where one side is staunch about this and the other side is staunch about that. And we never have conversations about how we can make our country, the world, our communities better, because we don't know how to talk about it.
Well, it's also because, those people also don't necessarily see young people having, a valid place in conversations about politics, or because it's been so overly dominated by, by men and by older people, where there's enormous power in younger people understanding their franchise, using their vote, using their voice. It maintains the status quo. So,
and I feel like you see young people having these conversations in a different way than they did when we were teenagers, which is really cool to see too. I mean, I know that we're all like a product of our own social media experiments. And so of course, like, my Instagram and TikTok and Twitter are all very, like, very political. But watching some of these teens on TikTok talk about policy and politics, I love it. I love it. It's conversation. It's the kind of content I wish I had as a teenager.
Yeah, me too. I do. Along with more women on the wall. So,
oh my goodness, absolutely.
Yeah, we need to put more women on the wall. Well, we've had a really lovely conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about Politics Now, where can they go to do that?
So you can go to our website. It is www.polynow.org. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. It's at polynow.org. Or you can find me on Instagram and Twitter, which is at Kinsley Malo.
Great. Well, thanks, Amanda.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was great.
Yeah, no, keep creating products and helping women and people get elected. Just
and you keep making me awesome stuff that I can wear to the playground and scare the other parents when I'm at the park. Yes. I love that I can like walk into any room and wear exactly who I am on my shirt, and people are like, "Whoa!"
The political moms are here.
Yeah, I've always been intense as a person, but now at 35, I'm just like, I want it to like precede me when I enter a room. So thank you for making that clothing for me.
You're very welcome. Yeah, it's amazing to hear people. You know, there were a few people who, on the day that the Roe versus Wade decision came, there were a couple of people who wore it very intentionally. They were traveling, and so they wore it on the plane. Two of them actually ran into each other at Pearson, which was amazing. And they had like a moment in the airport. And then they both wrote me about it. I know, right?
Oh my goodness, that's so sweet.
I know.
I forgot to tell you that I wore mine. So I happened to be in DC when the decision leaked back in May. And I wore my A Woman's Place sweatshirt when I went to the protest on day 2. And I got a lot of like really wonderful compliments, and I directed them all your way. But it just felt really empowering to be able to like wear exactly how I felt and have that message just be out in the world without me having to express it constantly. Like it felt like it was like part of a uniform.
Yeah.
I felt very powerful. So thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. I mean, that's how it started for me. Was the first sweater I ever made was for the night of the 2016 election. It was black with neon pink, and it had, because I was hoping that Hillary Clinton would be elected, and it said, what did it say? It had, I think, Secretary of State, Ambassador, and I drew lines through each of them, and then I had a space missing. I can't remember now off the top of my head, obviously where president would go, and then I would have put a line through it. And that was like, that you can just in the same way you support, a sports team, right? Mm-hmm. You should also be able to wear your politics and wear your support and your advocacy for women in politics and for different issues. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you for that, and thank you for this conversation, because it's been great.
No, thank you, Amanda. Until next time.